Hi, my name is Doug Mafucci. My wife Barbara and I founded Atlantic Brewing Company over 25 years ago at the beginning of the American craft beer movement. And back in those days, there were less than 200 of us brewing beer in the country. Today, there are over 4,000 breweries making wonderful craft beer. And Barbara and I are very excited to be part of the beginning of that revolution and, of course, what's going on now in the American craft beer scene. It's a wonderful time to be brewing beer. We began very small, brewing 31 gallons at a time in small containers next to our little hippie brew pub called the Lompoc. And now we're at the point at this new facility we're at now where we can brew over 2,000 gallons in a day. Still very small by big brewing standards, but still a size that we can manage, and we can do a lot of interesting things making beer. The challenge for us, though, has always been to keep our brewery and our focus here on Mount Desert Island and Acadia National Park. And we've continued to do that in a very wonderful way. One of the ways we did that was we moved our brewery from downtown to this farm homestead that we found that needed to be brought back. And this building we're in right now has beautiful hand-hewn timbers from the 1700s. It had hand-cut granite stones, blocks, that we're able to repurpose into benches and walkways and walls. There were even heirloom apple fruit trees and pear trees in the woods that were buried. We found them accidentally and pulled them out and restored them and brought them back, and they're being used here to enjoy right now. We made a really nice place for people to experience beer here in the countryside. Our big challenge, though, was how we're going to do this, people to visit this facility, while at the same time we had to boil water, make beer, have trucks, and all these kinds of things that go on with beer making. And we did a lot of research and coordination here, and we sort of took some models we saw in Northern Europe that were like this, and we really cobbled together a really interesting mix where the consumer comes here, they get that great feeling, the great aesthetic that we have here, they can see how beer is made firsthand, and it all happens in a way that respects the land, the countryside that we're in. There's a lot of management of energy, of recycling, of light, of reflection, all these things that make the place work. And I think what I'll do is, if you'll join me, I'll take you on a tour of our facility where I'll touch on some of the really interesting things we do, which are quite simple, but really make things work. Here we are in the brew house, the first step in making beer. We begin using these two tanks called the mash tank and the kettle, and we start with malted barley. Malted barley is a grain just like any other grain that the farmer grows, but malted barley is a little different than plain old farmer's barley. Malted barley, what the farmer does is he harvests it like any other grain, he sends it off to a maltster. The maltster takes that grain and puts it in a warm bath, and the grain begins to sprout. And the maltster will sprout 20, 30 tons of this grain at one time. And the sprouted grain, once the little rootlet gets to be about as long as the barley kernel, the maltster knows now it's time to stop the sprouting, drain the water out, and rake all this sprouted grains into a warming oven where they will dry it, toast it, roast it, and make various varieties of barleys that we use to make different flavors of beer. And the reason we use malted barley as opposed to plain old farmer's barley is that malted barley, because of the malting process, will make 8 times as much sugar for us when we're making our beer as plain old farmer's barley. The sugar we're making is called maltose. Maltose is a very sweet sugar, and it has that nice round flavor that craft brewers love to generate. So the first thing we do is we get this sprouted barley that we don't do ourselves, we get it from maltster. It comes from our silo in the back of the brewery, gets pumped over into a mill. The grain gets milled the morning of the brewer. Our brewer gets here about 5 o'clock in the morning. He weighs out his recipe, a little dark, a little light, a little wheat, just different kinds of malted grains. He grinds it up in the mill. It drops down into this tank right here called the mash tank. Now the mash tank is basically a giant sort of steeping vessel. What happens is this crushed up barley, malted barley, mixes with water, and a great thing happens in about 30 minutes. The brewer starts with about 600 pounds of malted barley ground up. He adds about 400 pounds of water into this vessel. He's got about 1,000 pounds of what looks like a nice warm breakfast cereal. And what happens in 30 minutes is that this barley, the grains in the barley, the starches meet the enzymes. And if you recall from high school biology, starch and enzyme make sugar. And this entire vat of starchy material goes from being starchy to being sweet, incredibly sweet. In fact, the brewer will make over 500 pounds in liquid form of maltose sugar in this mash tank in 30 minutes. And we do that twice a day to make our sugar, because we need sugars to make alcohol. So the brewer does this mashing. Like I said, he gets here at 5 o'clock in the morning. He mashes this grain, hydrates it, gets the sugar conversion. And on the bottom of this tank, there is a nice screen that holds the malted barley, soggy barley on top, and allows all the sugar water to permeate and drop in the bottom. What comes out is nice sugary water that he pumps from here into our kettle. What's left behind is a little bit of soggy grain with some sugar in it. He connects a fitting called a sparge arm, which is basically an expensive glorified shower head, and he showers the remaining grain, and he rinses it and rinses it and rinses it, and that rinse water, we call sparge water, still has sugar. He's rinsed off all the sugars off of that remaining grain, and that sparge water we pump over as well. It's not nearly as sweet as the first runnings, but it still gets us another 30 or 40 pounds of sugar. And as brewers, we want to get as much sugar as we can out of that barley, because malted barley is a very expensive commodity compared to rice or corn. And that's why we want to make sure we get our best efficiencies. So he gets his first runnings, his sparge runnings, and he's got a kettle full of sugary amber sugar water. He turns on the kettle and it comes to a boil. And while it's coming to a boil, our brewer goes back to this vessel and hand rakes out all this soggy, what we call spent grain. And the spent grain is put into barrels, wheeled off to the back of our brewery, where a local farmer or two will come by every other day and pick up this grain, and we get to let them use it for silage for their livestock. And if they can't pick it up, we bring it to our other farm where we compost it ourselves. So 99.9% of this grain is getting used again, either as silage or as compost. And that's the first step we do in utilizing what we've got here. Now, the brewer, it's 5 o'clock in the morning, takes about 2 hours to do this mashing and raking out process. The brewer now goes back to his kettle. After he's done raking, it comes to a nice boil, and the brewer will add his hops, the little leaf hops, and flavor and spice the wort up. We now are going to take this hoppy sugar water, and we're going to take it from near boiling and pump it into one of our nice ice cream cone shaped fermenters, and add yeast and begin the brewing process, or the fermentation process. We've got one big problem though, and that is this is nearly boiling. And if we put it into there nearly boiling and add our yeast, we're going to kill our yeast. Just like when you make homemade bread, if they say don't add boiling water to your yeast because you'll kill it. Yeast likes to live at our temperature, 65 to 68 degrees. So we have to get it from this near boiling temperature into that kettle quickly enough that no bacteria will get back in the beer. We just spent time boiling it to purify it. We want to make sure it stays pure. So a little device we have is called a heat exchanger, basically a backwards radiator. This is a piece of it. There's a box about this big which has about 20 of these plates packed together with a gasket between it. And what happens is the boiling sugar water comes in here and rides down this pathway on highway A and goes to the next panel, the next panel, the next panel, and like a serpentine pattern. On the other side of each one of these plates, we pump ice cold well water from 300 feet down the ground from our granite well. The ice cold well water goes this way, the hot sugar water goes that way, and because metal has virtually no R value, they exchange their heat. And the beauty of this designed box, the heat exchanger, it was designed by someone called a thermohydrodynamic engineer. They figured out the flow and the size. The boiling sugar water goes in here on highway A, almost boiling, comes out, seconds later, about 17 seconds later, into the fermenter at 68 degrees. That's great. We got our wort cooled down, ready for its yeast. But even better than that, the ice cold well water going on Highway B, well, that went in, God, in the 50s, and that comes out on the other side hot. We make hot water by cooling our boiling sugar water. We're able to recycle that water and make basically free hot water. And next to beer, the most important liquid we need at a brewery is hot water. Washing kegs, washing the floors, washing the tanks, washing the bottles. And we reserve that hot water in a hot water tank that we reuse right away. This little box makes over 100,000 gallons of hot water for us a year. And that little technique not only saves us money, we're not using anywhere near the energy we'd use to make hot water conventionally. We just use a pump to run it through a heat exchanger. So now we have pumped our wort into our fermenter, got it to 68 degrees, perfect temperature for yeast to propagate. These nice ice cream cone double-lined fermenter units are what we're going to use. We will pump in about 2 gallons of yeast into the bottom of the tank. The yeast goes into this vessel and says, oh boy, my favorite thing, hoppy sugar water. And the yeast just goes active and goes on all those wonderful sugar molecules and does primarily 2 things. It makes CO2, the bubbles in beer, and also makes ethanol, the alcohol in beer, as well as numerous other esters that make beer such a wonderful beverage. It will do this fermentation for about, 5 or 6 days, depending on the yeast and the temperature. In the first day, it just multiplies and makes plenty of cells. It's called the aerobic cycle. It eats up all the air in the tank, all the oxygen. On the second, third, fourth, and fifth day, it stops making so much growth and does its time making ethanol and making CO2 gas bubbles. After about 5 or 6 days, the yeast goes, oh good, I'm done, I'm sleepy, I've done my job. And now we've got a big 60 keg vat of what we call roux beer. It's legally beer, it's got all the alcohol it's going to have, all the esters, all the aromas, but it's got a lot of things in there we want to get out, a lot of extra yeast, some little floaty hop things like that. And that beer, it's really roux beer. It's about 5 days old. It's hard to tell, but it's full of cloudy yeast material. It's actually interesting stuff. It's full of vitamin B, but it's not really a refreshing beverage. It's got too much in it. You need to sort of polish it and make it a crisp, nice ale to drink. And this entire vat is full of material just like this. What we do around day 6 or 7, depending on how the beer is going, is we take this nice 68-degree roux beer and we chill the vat down to about 30 degrees. Beer freezes at like 27, so it's below freezing for water but above freezing for beer. And by getting it really cold, we enhance and accelerate a process called flocculation. And what happens is all these yeast buds and everything will slide to the side of the tank, hit the cold wall, and slide down this nice 60-degree cone and settle in the bottom. And our brewer, beginning on day 6, will begin to harvest out this yeast and hop material. And he knows from experience the color, the texture, what the really good stuff is that we can reuse to make more beer. What's interesting is we started with 2 gallons of yeast to get this thing going. By day 6, we have about 11 times that amount of yeast that's been grown. We pull out 2 or 3 gallons to reuse the really nice stuff. We send it to our lab to confirm its viability. The rest, we add on to our spent grain mash and compost that as well. And actually, some people, larger brewers, actually will dry brewer's yeast. People use it as a health food, but we give it to livestock and it seems to make them healthy and happy. So we will continue to do this day 7, day 8, day 9. By around day 10, if I were to draw again a sample of this beer, it wouldn't look all cloudy like this and all murky full of yeast. It would be fairly clean, like a really nice homebrewed beer. Still not professionally polished, but a really nice beer, a drinkable beer that would work fine. But what we do as professional brewers is we do one more step, and that is we will wheel over a big filter here, which is comprised of basically plant cellulose, and we run it through this filter over here and put it into what's called a bright tank or a polishing tank. So here the beer goes, its last day before it gets packaged, it goes into one of these tanks. If you notice, these tanks have no cone bottom. They're merely a pressure tank. The beer goes in here, and even though the beer has been naturally carbonated in the unitank, in the fermenter, we tweak it a little bit to get it exactly the same level of carbonation every time. So when a bartender pulls that tap or a person opens that bottle, that beer has the same level of carbonation every time. Believe it or not, carbonation affects flavor. The amount of carbonation is a component of how the beer tastes, and we want to make it just right. So we tweak it here. It stays in the bright tank for a day, and once that happens, this vessel here and the one next to it are basically, when they're all done, this is a giant keg of beer. I've got 12,500 glasses of beer ready to go in this. Unfortunately, this won't fit in my living room, so I've got to put it into kegs and bottles to make it more usable. And that's the next step in our process. And that's the packaging of the beer, the bottling of the beer. So far, we have made sugar water from grinding up grain and mashing it. We're able to take that spent grain and give it to farmers or compost it. We then cool that sugar water using a heat exchanger, making virtually free hot water that we can reuse. We then put it into the fermenter at the right temperature, added our yeast, and then let our yeast grow and grow and grow, and then we harvest that yeast and reuse that yeast. All the components are being either reused, recycled, or enjoyed by someone else. We've then cooled it, got it into our bright tank, where we finished carbonating it, and now it's ready to go into a bottle. Well, to fill a bottle of beer is actually nearly as much work as making the beer, because believe it or not, you don't just take a hose and turn a valve on and fill it like a faucet, because the beer is carbonated. It will just foam right up, like you can't pour soda into a soda. The way we do it is called counter pressure filling. Counter pressure filling, well, I'll explain how we did it our first year. Our first year, we didn't have this beautiful Italian bottling machine line. We actually did them one at a time by hand. We had a stopper with a double-lined pipe that came out the top. One pipe went over here to a valve that went to a CO2 source. The other pipe went to a valve that went to a beer source, the beer. And on top was a little escape bleeder valve. And we put this rig on a bottle, clamp it down. We turn the CO2 on with the beer closed, and the CO2 would come in, and because the top valve was open and CO2 is heavier than air, the CO2 would go in there, push the air up and out. Then we count about 2 seconds, and we close the escape hatch, and the CO2 would keep coming in up to about 14 pounds pressure, 12 to 14 pounds pressure. And now we had a bottle full of CO2 gas. We then close the CO2 gas line, open the beer line, and the beer would come in on a plate, clear hose, and go zzz, and stop about 1 inch from the bottle, because the CO2 was at 12 to 14 pounds, and the beer was 1 pound or 2 less pressure, and it couldn't go in there. It's some law of gases I didn't pay attention to in high school physics, but I wish I had. The next thing we do is we loosen this little bleeder valve and begin to gently lower the CO2 pressure in the bottle. And once we got to the point where the difference was that this was lower than the beer would flow in beautiful equilibrium and fill. It looked like water. There'd be no bubbles because it was perfectly in equilibrium. Gets to the top, we close the beer valve, close this valve, lift this rig up, and as that pipe came out, it would drop the beer down to that beautiful fill height that every beer has. Unfortunately, what immediately got back in that little fill height area is air with oxygen, and that can ruin your beer in as little as a week or two. We've got to get that out. And the way we did it was the old-fashioned way called knocking. You would actually hit the bottle and agitate it, and it would make a little foam. And that foam would go up like a piston of bubbles, which is basically CO2 with a little bit of beer hanging on. That's what foam is. And would push up, and when it got to the top, we'd put a cap on it and cap it. One whole bottle of beer. Well, obviously that was not a very efficient way, but it's the only way we can afford. Eventually, we ramped up to different kind of bottling machines, and now we have this beautiful machine from northern Italy that does all those steps automatically with solenoid switches, controls. It actually takes the air out twice, not once, and we're able to cap a bottle of beer, make sure there's no air in the neck, and have a really nice fill. And this machine can do about 3,000 bottles an hour. Still quite slow by big brewery standards, but fine for us. So now we've bottled beer. We've got beautiful, cool bottled beer with no air in it. And now we've got to get it into our warehouse. And here's where a lot of the planning really shines for Atlantic Brewing Company. This facility that we're in was designed such to really maximize the environment we're in. It has a reflective metal coating that keeps the building very cool in the summer. The way the glass and windows were designed was that we get nice warm sun in the winter when the sun is low, and when the sun is high in the summer, it doesn't heat up the building. Of course, the building is super insulated to allow the coolness to stay in here. But most importantly, and this is something we can't take credit for, Acadia National Park and Mount Desert Island sit on a big mound of rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, away from the Gulf Stream. The water is very cold here, and the air is very cool here. We take that natural phenomenon and use that with our passive design here to create a warehouse which is cellar temperature year-round. Even in the height of the summer when it gets really hot by our standards, like 80 degrees, it's nice and cool in the warehouse, the above-ground warehouse. There's no artificial refrigeration used at all in that warehouse. We just use what the environment gives us and integrate it. And that allows us to take this beautiful beer, put it in cellar temperature, which makes the beer really happy, and the beer is ready to go. And we have our fleet of one truck that picks it up and drives around and delivers the beer. Gosh, 80% of our customers are probably within 15 miles of this brewery. That's the loop we really are proud of and we really worked hard to make. In addition to that, we employ a lot of other methods that help us. For example, we actually have an aerobic wastewater treatment facility that we built here. And it's kind of neat. I've learned a lot about this. These little plastic discs, it's this giant vat full of these plastic discs that they grow bacteria on, and that friendly bacteria eats the waste and processes the waste in a very small footprint. We've got a probably, I don't know, a few hundred square foot area that we do this with. It has a lot of computer technologies, which I don't understand, but it works. In addition to the wastewater, of course, whenever we can, especially in our shops, carriers and boxes, it's all recycled. Everything gets handled that way. We've actually teamed up with a local vendor in the park to actually take their boxes every week or so that comes back to us. And we've sort of extended out what we can do with our cardboard, which is really pleasing as well. The whole process here is really a lot of simple steps and designs, but in the aggregate, they work wonderfully together. Our visitor gets to really come in and see how beer is made in a safe manner. We have a really aesthetically pleasing restored farmhouse to reuse again and get another, hopefully, few generations to enjoy this property. We're able to integrate technologies to make our process work with the land and not chew up the land, to really use it. The beauty of this is that basically, because of our business model, we get to know our customers and they get to know us. And it's a really great sort of exchange between consumer and manufacturer that we really enjoy here. And the nice thing is we're able to accomplish that challenge that we started out with, which was how to make this facility work aesthetically, sustainably, and also be an enjoyable place to visit and hopefully make a profit. And that's what we're doing here. We really enjoy this.